Our guest today is so great that she's the first guest that we've had on the podcast for a second time. Her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, is now available in paperback. Heather McGhee, thank you so much for coming back to the Suburban Women Problem.
I'm so glad.
Amanda got to interview you last season, so I'm actually really excited that I get to be the one that gets to interview you today. One thing that you and Amanda talked about the last time you were on here, and something that actually really stuck with me, I really listening to the story and just the visual of it, was embedded in my mind after that episode, was about the drained pool politics. Can you just remind us of what drained pool politics are and why they're important?
I spent nearly 2 decades working at and then leading an economic think tank that was focused on trying to solve problems in the American economy. Things like basically answer the question, why is it that we can't seem to have nice things? And by nice things, I mean like a well-funded public school in every neighborhood and affordable, health care that's guaranteed and childcare and elder care, all the things that, just a family needs. Why is it so hard for the average family to grab a hold of those nice things? I set out on this journey to write The Sum of Us, to really try to answer the question better than I'd been able to answer it in the halls of power and working at a think tank. And one of the first places I went was Montgomery, Alabama. And Montgomery, Alabama has a central park called Oak Park that is the really, just sort of the beautiful park there. And there I walked the grounds of what used to be a 1,000+ person publicly funded and built swimming pool. That was part of the building boom of public swimming pools and really public amenities, public goods like libraries and roads and bridges, parks and pools in the 1930s and 40s as part of this ethos of public goods, right? This sort of idea that Americans held true, really coming out of the Depression, that, it's government's right and responsibility to ensure a decent standard of living for her people. When I talk about drained pool politics, it's because of what happened when those public pools, which were largely, and I'm always clear to say, not just in the Jim Crow South, were largely segregated or for whites only, either with a sign on the fence or just by custom and enforced through intimidation and violence. And when those pools were integrated or desegregated by the courts, after Black families were able to successfully argue and say, those are our tax dollars that have been funding those public goods all along, as well. And we want our kids to swim too, in the case of the swimming pools. Towns and cities across the country decided to drain their public pools rather than integrate them. And so in Montgomery, they, effective January 1st, 1959, actually closed the pool, drained it of water, filled it in with dirt. They closed the entire park. They sold off the animals in the zoo. They closed the entire Parks and Recreation Department of the city and kept it closed for a decade until 1970, all to stop little Black kids and little white kids from swimming together in the deep end of the pool. And for me, as a mom, as someone who understands the difference in quality of life of having nice parks, wonderful
Right.
schools, well-funded libraries, right? That idea that the difference between a well-funded public good and one that's really starved for resources so often has to do with race. And that when our country was 90% white and segregation was the law and the custom of the land, public goods were really well funded, lavish, 1,000+ person resort style swimming pools. And when our countries become more diverse, that's when we've had these really nasty fights about just spending our collective resources on our people.
I completely understand that, especially as a legislator who has to look at how we spend our tax dollars in the state of Georgia. Tax dollars are basically an investment by the people who live in that place. And, asking for there to be things for them is just asking for a return on that investment. And we have this fight all the time. So I completely understand where you're coming from. I want to actually talk a little bit about something different or maybe it's not different, maybe it's one and the same, and that's housing discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically in the suburbs. And so I want to start with redlining. So can you kind of explain redlining to our listeners and just
Mm.
explain how it has shaped the suburbs that we have today?
So, Jasmine, I'm really glad you asked me that because this is one of the stories I tell over and over again in the book, The Sum of Us, because it really does reveal in a way that I certainly wasn't aware growing up living in cities and in suburbs when I was younger, um, just how much explicitly racist laws shaped how and where we live today, white people and folks of color, right? It shapes the way our houses were built, whether they were, duplexes and triplexes or whether they were single family homes. That was all about race. Redlining is a practice promulgated by the government and banks in the wake of the Great Depression, when, as one of those well funded public goods, the New Deal government spent a whole lot of resources trying to make home ownership something that working class families could do across the country. They really wanted to sort of backstop and subsidize the mortgage lenders in order to make home ownership a reality. It was really the sort of beginning of the invention by the government of the American dream of home ownership. And they did this massive investment in housing, but they based it on a series of maps that they drew of most of the cities in the country. And they shaded different neighborhoods with different colors and graded them different letters, like A, B, C, D, based on basically how white the neighborhood was. And that map told banks where they could and could not lend. And if they lent in a D grade area, they wouldn't get any of the federal guarantee or backstop or subsidy. So basically made no financial sense. So they just didn't do it. And this began in the 1930s. And it really didn't end until the Community Reinvestment Act of the 1970s. And I want to just read a typical thing that was written on the redlining maps, because sometimes people, they just don't realize how explicit it was. It said, "The neighborhood is graded D because of its concentration of Negroes, but the section may improve to a third class area as this element is forced out." Right? Okay, so that story of areas that were sort of rewarded with free government money in so many different ways and low and no interest loans from banks versus those that were shut out of any capital development is the story of how you create so many of the segregated places today and of the suburbs.
Just to hear it read out loud, it's one of those things that brings to mind one of the reasons why they're trying to ban, quote, critical race theory and ban certain books. They don't want people to know, they don't want people to have access to real, tangible, factual information that you cannot deny is racist.
That's exactly right. It's not a theory, it's facts they don't want us to
Exactly,
know. Yeah.
exactly. How would you say housing discrimination continues to affect racial inequality today?
Well, I have a whole chapter in my book about the financial crisis and the subprime mortgage crisis that really predated and caused the financial crash of 2008. And I think it's a really important story for basically everyone who owns a home, who lives in the suburbs, any of that to know, because it's not 1934, right? It's not ancient history. It's not black and white newsreel. It's a time in which we all
Right.
lived. And we saw the dominant media narrative that said this was about, homeowners speculating. This was about people getting mortgages that they couldn't afford and shouldn't have ever qualified for. Like, that's the dominant narrative. It created this resentment, this sense that we lost 8 million jobs and trillions in household wealth. The economy was in a free fall, all because of, your neighbor being irresponsible. And there was a racialized piece of it too, right? It was this sense that, like, black and brown folks were getting these mortgages that they shouldn't have been able to afford. And that's not at all true. So you get to I really understood in real time how it works, that a dominant narrative that sort of villainizes people of color and blames them for what's wrong in our society happens in real time, and how people who are very well meaning often end up parroting that. Actually, what happened with subprime was that after generations of redlining and not being allowed access to mainstream plain vanilla bank loans that you could pay off reasonably over 30 years, um, just over in a course of just 2 decades, it went from redlining Black neighborhoods to reverse redlining them. And in fact, flooding them with aggressive marketing, but not about vanilla loans that would secure homeownership, but rather with these new exotic types of loans that had balloon payments and prepayment penalties and high interest rates that were unrelated to your credit score. And it was that if you were Black, you were 3 times more likely to get a toxic subprime loan than if you were white. It was just about who was marketed, and then blatant discrimination inside these banks that the federal government would later sort of fine all the big banks for, just rampant discrimination. What that meant was that we had the majority of people who got subprime loans in the run up to the financial crisis were already homeowners. They weren't sort of being put into places that they, did not deserve to be. There are people who already had done it, had won, right? Had saved and won and created a nest egg of a home. And this was a refinance loan that ended up often stripping their wealth and ending in foreclosure. And then two, the other thing that is not the conventional wisdom is the idea that these were people who had bad credit. And so it was sort of a risk the banks took and they shouldn't have done it. Or that the borrowers just weren't worthy, right? The idea that it was the borrower's fault. But as it turns out, the majority of subprime loans that were issued in this country before 2007 went to people with prime credit scores, went to people who had scores that meant they could have had a safer, lower interest loan. And so this story for me is one of like a canary in the coal mine that was ignored, where Black and brown neighborhoods were the first ones to receive these really terrible loans in a very discriminatory pattern. And then it ended up obviously spiraling out of control as the market grew and grew and grew. Black families who were the, sort of last to the home ownership party have not recovered. That there is a gap in home ownership that is as wide, a Black-white gap that is as wide today as it was before the Fair Housing Act. Literally erased 2 generations of home ownership gains. It's devastating. And so that is a story of the American suburb as well.
Actually became a homeowner right around the time that all of that stuff was happening. I
Mm-hmm.
newly married, newlywed, bought a house, and then like everything just kind of spiraled out of control. Now I did not luckily I was not one of those people that ended up with one of those subprime mortgages, but I did feel the effects, and I can agree with you that the overwhelming narrative at the time was that it was a bunch of irresponsible people of color who should have never been able to get a house in the first place, and it basically tried to reinforce stereotypes of Black and brown people that already existed. And so for people who were hearing that, even if they were well-meaning or consider themselves liberal, they probably still felt like maybe there was some truth to that, because it reinforced things that have just been ingrained into our society over since basically the founding of our country. It's been a year since the last time you were on the podcast, and since then we've started seeing full-on book bans spreading across the country. Do you think things have gotten worse in the past year, or has anything gotten any better?
The paperback version of The Sum of Us is out now. It came out on Tuesday, February 8th. And so much happened since the book came out last February, including these escalating attacks on children's freedom to learn. And so I included a new chapter, and afterward in the paperback version, as well as a discussion guide, because I just felt like this was such an amazingly powerful example of this zero sum worldview, this way in which the billionaire right wing is funneling money towards these astroturf organizations and trying to scare white parents away from an integrated public good. It's like drained pool politics all over again. And it's zero sum racial politics because it's saying, my little white child can't read about Black history because that somehow takes something away from my white child. And I include the story of Rachel Vinman, whom I talked with on this podcast, and how she so beautifully explained that it was actually a real loss to her. And she, as a white woman, felt like she'd been robbed of her own history because she grew up in Oklahoma and never learned about the Tulsa race massacre until recently. And so I talk about how the attacks on our children's freedom to learn, the attacks on honest education are really all political. They're all about the right to use a culture war to divide and distract. I mean, what do suburban parents really need right now? How about a 7% cap on how much of their income? How about how about a cap of how much they pay for childcare at 7% of their income? How about more home care workers and elder care workers for their aging parents? How about universal pre-K and paid family leave, right? That's what suburban parents really need. They don't need chaos at their kids' school board meeting, and they don't need cranks calling up the library and saying, I want to see all the books that you have that mention the word racism. I mean, that's just not what families need. And yet that's the right wing distraction. And what are they distracting from? The fact that they are opposed to the Build Back Better agenda, which could demonstrably, in a way that I don't even think that families can even, I think even I, knowing as much as I do about the details of the Build Back Better bill, as a parent, as a working parent, I don't, to have that agenda that would guarantee those things for me and for my children and for the caregivers in my life. I mean, it would be transformational. And yet instead we're banning books. It's so frustrating. And yet it has so revealed what the right wing really wants to do with power, what they really think about us as parents, what they really think about our children, what their values are, that there is a movement of people, of parents who are saying, no, that's enough, right? These book bans are actually wildly unpopular, even though they're passing in a dozen states, these white discomfort laws, right? They're passing, but that's just because, the structures have kept up a Republican minority rule that is trying to foist its agenda on us. So I'm really excited about efforts like the Book Ban Busters with Red Wine and Blue and all of these other places across the country where people are standing up and saying, no, it's time to protect our children's freedom to learn. It's time not to fear our own history, and it's time to move forward together.
I love that, especially as a parent. Despite what the politicians at the top are doing, I realize they're not actually talking to people who these things are affecting. And those people are saying no. And I hope that we can, kind of reverse some of these bad policies once we get those people out of office for not doing their job, which is listening to the people they're supposed to represent. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and jump into our rapid fire questions. You're not new to this. First question, what's been your favorite binge watch from the past year?
I got into foreign language
Wow.
like streaming, and so I loved this show called Valeria, which it's like for women friends in Spain.
Oh, wow.
And it's a great sort of sexy, fun romp. Valeria. It's on Netflix. Valeria.
That sounds awesome. I think I saw that on my Netflix, actually. So if you had to be stranded on a desert island with any person in the world, who would it be?
Oh, my husband.
Oh, that's cute. All right, next question. What's something that always makes you laugh?
My son. I have a 3-year-old who's just, on a daily basis, he's got impeccable comic timing. It's natural, right? He's 3. It's not like he's picking it up from watching old, Eddie Murphy videos or anything. Like, it's just a natural. And he's so goofy. He's at that great age where he's putting together strange things and thoughts and, feeling very committed to the truth of the way he has figured out the world, and it's really funny.
So if you could learn one new skill overnight, what would it be?
I would say driving stick.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because I hate that I don't know that. It's like really counter to my personality that I don't know how to do that. At the same time, I think I could just actually do that. And so I'm going to do singing. Like, I have a decent voice, but I would like to have trained since I was 3 how to just have an amazing voice. And I'm not going to do that. And so overnight, I would like to have the skill of singing in perfect pitch.
I think same, except maybe also for me, piano. Yeah. So I could be like Alicia Keys. But yeah,
Yeah.
I can like play a little bit, but like I can't like
Hmm.
play. So if you had a time machine and you could go back and change one thing, but one thing only, what would you change?
Are elected officials paying more attention and taking earlier action on climate change? I mean, right? That's
Oh
the
my
only thing
gosh,
that matters.
yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. I still every day I think of like Don't Look Up and I'm like I am it is scary to me like how accurate that movie is just because
Yeah.
I'm like
Yeah.
there's a thing that is happening and everyone's pretending like the thing is not happening. All right, so that is actually the end of our rapid fire questions and before we go, where can people go to find out more about you and your book?
You can go to heathermcghee.com. McGhee has an H in it, McGhee, or the sum, SUM of us book.com. It's a play on the idea of the zero sum. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, H McGhee and Heather McGhee. And I hope to see you all there.
So glad I got a chance to talk with you today. So now I don't have to be envious of Amanda for getting to talk to you last time. So there's a little bit of envy there. And, just thank you so much for coming back to the Suburban Women Problem.
Thank you so much. Keep up the great work.